Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, first published in 1990, is a collection of interconnected stories about American soldiers serving in the Vietnam War. Blending memories, fiction, and personal reflection, O'Brien explores not only the physical objects soldiers carry into war, but also the invisible burdens of fear, guilt, grief, love, and memory that remain with them long after combat ends. O'Brien's literary style is fragmented, reflective, and metafictional, deliberately blurring the boundaries between fact and fiction. Through repetition, shifting perspectives, symbolism, and unreliable storytelling, he questions whether emotional truth can sometimes communicate an experience more powerfully than literal fact. The book explores themes of war, memory, trauma, courage, fear, guilt, friendship, storytelling, death, and the burden of the past. The Things They Carried remains important for its unconventional portrayal of the Vietnam War and its examination of how people use stories to understand, preserve, and sometimes survive experiences that are difficult to express directly. The story starts with Lieutenant Jimmy Cross leading Alpha Company through Vietnam while carrying memories of Martha, a college girl from New Jersey who does not love him the way he loves her. He keeps her letters, her photographs, and even a small pebble she sent him, turning these objects into private comforts during the war. His thoughts drift toward her constantly, sometimes tenderly, and sometimes with guilt and longing, even while he is responsible for the lives of his men. The soldiers carry many kinds of weight. Some of it is practical: weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, ponchos, food, mosquito repellent, marijuana, and letters from home. Some of it belongs to their roles. Cross carries maps and the burden of command. Rat Kiley the medic carries supplies for wounds and pain. Kiowa carries a Bible. Henry Dobbins carries extra rations and his girlfriend's pantyhose as a lucky charm. Ted Lavender, afraid and anxious, carries tranquilizers and marijuana to soften the terror around him. But the heaviest things are not always visible. The men carry fear, memory, grief, embarrassment, superstition, responsibility, and the land of Vietnam itself. When Lavender is shot after returning from the bathroom, his death comes suddenly and almost without drama. Cross is crushed by guilt because his mind had been on Martha instead of the mission. After the men burn the village of Thon Key and continue marching, Cross cries alone in his foxhole. The next morning, he burns Martha's letters and photographs, deciding that he must stop dreaming and become the leader his men need, even if they dislike him for it. Years after the war, Jimmy Cross visits Tim O'Brien in Massachusetts. They look through old photos, smoke, drink, and talk carefully around painful memories. Cross admits he still blames himself for Lavender's death. They also laugh about smaller, stranger details from the war, like Dobbins wearing pantyhose for luck. Eventually, O'Brien asks about Martha. Cross explains that he saw her again years later at a reunion, but even then she did not return his love. He still loves her. And when O'Brien says he may write a story about their conversation, Cross agrees, asking only that O'Brien make him seem brave and decent and leave out one especially humiliating part. O'Brien then broadens the book into a series of memories, fragments, and reflections. He says that war is not only terror and violence, it can also contain moments that feel strangely sweet, absurd, or beautiful. The men guide themselves through minefields with the help of an old Vietnamese man. Sanders mails lice to his draft board. Dobbins and Bowker play checkers in foxholes. Azar gives chocolate to a boy with one leg, but later kills Lavender's puppy. These memories do not line up neatly because war itself does not feel neat. For O'Brien, writing becomes a way to live with what will not leave him alone. One of his most private memories comes from before he ever reaches Vietnam. In 1968, shortly after graduating from college, O'Brien receives his draft notice. He opposes the war and does not understand what America is truly fighting for. But he also fears the shame of refusing to go. He spends the summer working in a meatpacking plant, coming home each day smelling of blood and pigs, unable to decide whether to flee to Canada or report for duty. Finally, he drives north to the Rainy River near the Canadian border and stays at the Tip Top Lodge with an elderly man named Elroy Birdall. Elroy never asks direct questions, but O'Brien senses that he understands. For 6 days, the two men eat together, work, play Scrabble, and share silence. On the last day, Elroy takes O'Brien fishing close enough to Canada that O'Brien could swim to shore and escape the draft. Instead, O'Brien cries in the boat and realizes that he will go to war, not because he believes in it, but because he is too embarrassed not to. He later calls this a failure of courage. Other stories show how war distorts friendship and fear. Dave Jensen and Lee Strunk fight violently over a stolen jackknife, and Jensen breaks Strunk's nose. Terrified of revenge, Jensen eventually breaks his own nose to even the score. Later, the two men become close and make a pact that if one is horribly wounded, the other will kill him. When Strunk loses part of his leg, he begs Jensen not to keep the promise. Jensen is relieved when Strunk dies on the helicopter ride away, because he no longer has to decide. O'Brien also reflects on what makes a war story feel true. Rat Kiley writes a heartfelt letter to Kurt Lemon's sister after Lemon dies, but she never replies, and Rat responds with bitterness. Lemon's death itself is almost impossible to explain cleanly. He is playing with Rat one moment and blown apart by a rigged mortar round the next. O'Brien says true war stories do not offer simple lessons. Sometimes they contradict themselves. Sometimes the most unbelievable parts feel truest. Mitchell Sanders tells one such story about soldiers on a listening post in the mountains who begin hearing impossible sounds. Music, voices, parties, monkeys, and trees. They call in airstrikes and destroy everything around them, but the sounds remain. Sanders later admits some parts are invented, but O'Brien suggests that invention can carry emotional truth. He returns to Kurt Lemon's death again and again, trying to describe the way sunlight seemed to lift him into the air. The point is not a moral. The point is the feeling that stays. Rat Kiley tells another haunting story about Mary Ann Bell, a young woman brought to a quiet medical outpost by her boyfriend Mark Fossey. At first she seems innocent and out of place in Vietnam, but she adapts quickly. She learns the language, helps with casualties, and becomes fascinated by the war. Fossey wants her to go home, but Mary Ann drifts farther from him and deeper into the jungle. Eventually she joins the Green Berets, wears a necklace of human tongues, and seems to belong more to Vietnam than to her old life. The story suggests that the war can change anyone, not only the men officially sent to fight it. Some memories are smaller but still meaningful. Dobbins keeps wearing his girlfriend's pantyhose as protection even after she leaves him. The platoon stays for a time in a pagoda where monks help them and clean Dobbins' machine gun. Dobbins says he is not deeply religious, but he likes the idea of being kind to people. In a world where almost nothing makes sense, simple gentleness becomes its own kind of belief. Then O'Brien returns to the young Vietnamese man he kills near My Cay. He describes the body in painful detail and imagines the man's life, a farmer's son, perhaps a student, perhaps someone who does not want to fight at all. Kiowa tries to comfort O'Brien, reminding him that the man had a weapon and that war leaves no clean choices. But O'Brien cannot stop staring. Years later, when his daughter Kathleen asks whether he has ever killed anyone, he says no, while privately imagining how he might tell her the full story if she were old enough to understand. Another scene shows a young Vietnamese girl dancing after her village has been burned and her family killed. The soldiers cannot agree on what the dance means. Azar mocks her movements later, turning them into something cruel and obscene, until Dobbins threatens to throw him into a well unless he dances respectfully. Even when the men cannot understand grief, the story insists that they should not mock it. After the war, Norman Bowker returns to Iowa with medals, but no real place to put his memories. On the 4th of July, he drives again and again around the lake, thinking about his father, his old girlfriend, a drowned friend from childhood, and the silver star he almost won. The memory circles back to the night Kiowa dies in a sewage field beside the Song Tra Bong. Mortars fall, the field seems to explode, and Bowker tries to pull Kiowa free from the muck. He cannot hold on and lets go to save himself. Years later, he wants to tell someone, but no one in his town can receive the story. O'Brien explains that Bowker later writes him a long letter saying he cannot find a meaningful life after Vietnam. Bowker asks O'Brien to write about a man who has lost the will to live. O'Brien writes a version of the story but leaves out Kiowa, and Bowker is disappointed. 8 months later, Bowker hangs himself. O'Brien later revises the story, restoring the sewage field and Kiowa's death because those details are the emotional center. The morning after Kiowa dies, the platoon searches the field for his body. Cross blames himself for choosing the campsite, even though orders came from above. A young unnamed soldier also blames himself because he was showing Kiowa a picture of his girlfriend with a flashlight when the attack began. The men finally find Kiowa buried in the mud and pull him out. Even Azar, who had been making cruel jokes, apologizes. Cross keeps composing a letter to Kiowa's father in his head, but his thoughts drift toward blame, responsibility, and escape. O'Brien later separates happening truth from story truth. He says that he saw a man die near my key, but also says he did not kill him, then admits that the story has been shaped to make the reader feel what he felt. For him, a story can be truer than a factual account if it brings the emotional reality back to life. Years later, O'Brien returns to the field where Kiowa died, bringing his daughter Kathleen and an interpreter. The place looks different and dry, and Kathleen is bored and confused by the trip. O'Brien wades into the water and leaves Kiowa's moccasins where he imagines his friend sank. Kathleen asks whether an old man nearby is angry at him, and O'Brien says the anger is finished, though the memory clearly is not. Another memory centers on Bobby Jorgensen, the medic who replaces Rat Kiley. O'Brien is shot twice in Vietnam. The first time, Rat treats him quickly and well. The second time, Jorgensen freezes and fails to treat his shock properly, leaving O'Brien in terrible pain and danger. Later, after O'Brien is moved to a safer supply job, he becomes obsessed with revenge. When Jorgensen apologizes sincerely, O'Brien feels guilty but cannot let go of his anger. He and Azar try to frighten Jorgensen during night duty, but the prank loses its power when Jorgensen stays calm and O'Brien sees his own pettiness. In the end, O'Brien and Jorgensen make peace and even joke about turning the scare on Azar. Rat Kiley eventually breaks under the pressure of being a medic. During a night marching operation, the fear and exhaustion become unbearable. Rat talks constantly about body parts, bugs, and the horror of patching men together only to see them die. He finally shoots himself in the toe badly enough to be removed from combat. No one condemns him. Even Cross agrees to support the story that gets him out. The final story reaches back before Vietnam to O'Brien's childhood love for a girl named Linda. When they are 9, O'Brien takes her to a movie with their parents and realizes he loves her. Later, Linda gets sick and dies. O'Brien sees her body at the funeral home. Her death is his first real encounter with the dead. As a child, O'Brien learns to bring Linda back through dreams and imagination. As a soldier, he sees the men do something similar with their dead, telling stories about Ted Lavender, Kurt Lemon, Kiowa, and others so they remain present in some form. By the end, O'Brien suggests that storytelling cannot undo death, guilt, or war, but it can keep the dead moving in memory. In stories, the lost can speak again, and the living can continue carrying them.